My name is Guy Burgess. I'm with the Beyond Intractability project here at the University of Colorado. And I'd like to tell you about a new effort that we're trying to organize, the Constructive Conflict Initiative. Now, the initiative is simply an effort to promote awareness of what we regard as the most serious threat facing humanity, the destructive way in which we handle so many of our difficult conflicts, and to promote more constructive approaches to those same conflicts. Now, to get a sense of what we're trying to do, it's, I think, worthwhile to tell the story of the emergence of the climate change movement. Now, in the early 1980s, climate scientists were aware of the way in which human activity was starting to change the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And they understood the basic physics of the atmosphere, the greenhouse effect, and understood the interrelationship between chemical changes in the atmosphere and the energy balance of the atmosphere, and how that could start to change weather patterns. And that led to the relatively obvious conclusion that some places that weren't used to dry periods would suffer terrible droughts. Some places that weren't used to lots of water would suffer terrible floods. And some places that weren't used to big storms would suffer terrible storms. And then they started looking further into the future, and the population growth projections and projections of the increasing emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And they started to say, now, wait a second, we're not just climate scientists going to academic conferences. We've understood a serious threat to humanity that wasn't being effectively addressed. In fact, it wasn't even really being understood. And we also understood that there were opportunities available for limiting that threat. They might be expensive and difficult, but they were realistic. And they concluded that they had a moral obligation to leave the academic arena and enter the political arena and aggressively promote efforts to address the problem. And this was something that they felt they owed to their children and their grandchildren and everybody's grandchildren. So 25 years after that, it's a long time, the what then was called the climate change movement, or came to be called the climate change movement, had progressed to the point where they awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And it's been 10 years, in fact, over 10 years since that, and the climate movement has accomplished a great deal. They've sounded the alarm. People in a large fraction of the global population now understand the nature of the threat. They've clarified it. It turned out to be a lot more complex than they originally thought. They've identified and evaluated a wide range of really impressive solutions, ways of changing the way in which, the energy economy of the world. They've attracted major financial support. There's lots of money going into this, lots of creative work. They've mobilized a major political movement that in many parts of the world is one of the biggest political forces within particular countries. And they've persuaded lots of people to start doing things to reduce their own individual carbon footprint. But it's also pretty clear that the climate change movement faces serious problems in the conflict arena. They've been unable to really navigate pushback from the what you might call the carbon industrial complex, and they've had trouble figuring out how to wisely and equitably distribute the costs and benefits of responding to the climate change challenge. And you have things like the Yellow Vest movement in Paris, where there was a rebellion against some of the carbon taxes. And the situation is still serious. As this UN report points out, time is running out, and we're really getting to the point where if we don't do an enormous amount in the next decade, it's going to be too late to avoid a lot of really terrible outcomes. Now, over the last 25 years, we've been working with another group of specialists, not climate scientists, but people who specialize in conflict resolution and peace building. And we've been focusing on the problem of intractable conflict. That is, those conflicts that defy the best available conflict resolution and peace building strategies. And the more we've looked at this, the more obvious it becomes that the threat posed by destructive conflict is even more serious than the threat posed by climate change. And the reason, in part, is that it encompasses climate change. We can't effectively respond to climate change because we're not dealing with the conflicts surrounding climate change. And we've come to the conclusion that the problem demands a response of similar scope to what the climate change movement's been trying to achieve. Now, to explain a little bit more about the nature of the threat, the multifaceted nature of the threat that we see associated with conflict, it's worth going back and thinking for a moment about democracy. Now, we had thought that the arc of history was bending toward peace and democracy, certainly in the toward the end of the Cold War. And our image of democracy, and I think this was shared by a lot of folks, was not yet realized democratic ideal of a government that truly was of the people, by the people, and for the people, to use Abraham Lincoln's favorite phrase. But what democracy really is a wise and equitable system for handling conflicts in ways that protect individual rights and advance the common good. Now, it seems that democracy in the United States and in a great many other countries is threatened by extreme polarization. Now, these are some charts from a series of reports from the Pew Research Center documenting on how polarization has been progressively increasing in the United States, and the level of us versus them animosity is getting to the point where political affiliation and political prejudice is much more prominent than other kinds of prejudice. Now, this is reinforced by Mobilize the base politics, and I won't go into the details of how this all works, but suffice it to say that it's now the case that the way that you win elections from either the left or the right in the United States, and again in a lot of other countries, is by really firing up your base so they actually go to the polls and vote. And the way you do that is make them as fearful as possible about the possibility that the other side might actually win. And that further tends to drive us all apart. Now, you see this in the collapse of trust in what this pollster called government in Washington. In the early 60s, roughly 80% of the population thought that they trusted the government in Washington to do the right thing always or most of the time. Now it's down to 20%. That's a huge drop, 80 to 20%. Now, what are the implications of this kind of all-out us versus them conflict? Well, it can play out in a variety of ways. You can have two roughly equal power competing factions that are always fighting, and they prevent anything from getting done because they can block what everybody else can do, but they can't do anything. Now, there's also the very real possibility that one of those groups could emerge decisively more powerful than the other. And that's when you start to get suppression of one group by another, and in ways that history has shown can be pretty terrible. And there's also the risk that this could escalate into large-scale violence. So now, going back to this earlier diagram, we have to, I think, really look at the possibility that the arc of history is bending away from democracy and towards some combination of three dystopian futures. There's Anocracy, where there's just sort of anarchy and chaos and government can't do anything. There's Autocracy, where you have a single strong man in control that dominates, oppresses, and exploits everyone. And then there's a kinder, gentler cousin of that, Plutocracy, which is domination by the very wealthy, and the very real risk that this could escalate into violence and war. So, again, just take government in the United States and the United Kingdom as an example. Our democracies have become dysfunctional. If you look at what Congress does or what Parliament does in response to Brexit, is just sort of this paralysis. We can't really much do anything. And that's one nature of the threat, is a government that's incapacitated. Now, this obviously gives you to the point where you can't deal with global warming predictions, and it raises questions about whether the government can deal with other big issues like the economy, which is performing but not performing in a way that's providing a livable future and dignified work for everyone. There are other risks, the emergence of a scary infectious disease, for example. We're not prepared to handle that, and it's hard to see how we could with the kind of polarization and distrust that we have. And then there is a very real possibility that we're entering a period of extreme instability with respect to strategic weapons. And our ability to keep a lid on the nuclear arms race may be collapsing. And again, we need governments to have their act together in order to respond to this. Now, this is a picture from Venezuela that gives you a sense of what happens when a country lapses into full scale anocracy. Nothing works. You can't even buy toilet paper. The shelves in the stores are empty. And that's at least one flavor of the kind of dystopia that we may be falling into. There's also the threat of plutocracy. And Sarah Shays wrote this great book about how thieves of the state and corruption is a major threat to global security around the world. This chart, and we have on the website all of the references that I go to on this, but there's a great study of just how much more of each country's wealth has gone to the 1% over the last couple of decades. And it's stunning. And the United States and Russia top the list. In this country, between 1979 and 2007, the richest 1% went from getting 7.4% of the economy to 16%. That's over $1 trillion a year. That's enough to fund all of Social Security and defense. And if you look at this other chart, again, there are references on the website, almost all that money has gone to the top 1% of the 1%. And against this kind of failure, this sort of chaotic government and sort of edging towards anocracy and the transfer of wealth to the very, very rich, it's no wonder that people are losing support for democracy. And this is, again, another interesting citation of declining support for democracy around the world and more support for authoritarians. And the myth is that, boy, if we could just get a strong man on our side, well, we'll really make out. And that's really the only way we can defend our interests. The truth is that Lord Acton's law applies. He's the guy who said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the notion of a benevolent authoritarian is a pretty risky bet to make on the future. And then there's the risk of high-tech authoritarianism. And if you look at the kinds of things China is doing to the Uyghurs and the way in which they're using technology to exert ever stronger control on society. It's the kind of thing that George Orwell didn't even dream about in his most terrible nightmares. And think about applying the emerging surveillance technology to the philosophy of 1984, and you get a vision of the kind of threat that we're facing. And this, I think, is my favorite image to show just how bad autocracy or authoritarianism could be. This is a nighttime satellite view of North Korea. And you'll note that it's a black area. South Korea is full of bright lights. China's full of bright lights. And in North Korea, the regime has literally sucked the power out of the entire society. And that's another threat that we face that I think is comparable to climate change or worse. And then there's the prospect of large scale civil unrest. And anybody in the United States old enough to remember the civil unrest of the 60s. If you want a sense of what happened, there's this article from the Washington Post just on the 4 days in Washington, D.C., and what happened following the assassination of Martin Luther King. And that was repeated again and again and again, not only in the days following the King assassination, but there were lots of other riots in the 60s. And you know, that could happen again. And then, if you really want a sense of how bad it could be, look at Syria. And it's a society that has totally collapsed into violence. And that also is what we're trying to figure out how to avoid. And then there's the allure of revolutions, that things are bad and we just need a revolution. Problem with revolutions is that you don't have in the absence of an agreement on the kind of society that you'd like to live in after the revolution, which really is some flavor of an ideal democracy that really does protect the interests of the population. What you're likely to get is just a struggle for power and an exchange of elites. So again, even figuring out how to do all this is a conflict problem. So the bottom line, and again, this is going back to this comparison of the conflict problem with the climate change movement. And I think it's pretty clear that the first of the points that I made applies, that destructive conflict is a threat that's more serious. And if you look at these terrible dystopian scenarios I just laid out, it's more serious than climate change. And again, it encompasses climate change. So this raises the next big question. Are there realistic steps that could be taken but aren't being taken to limit this? And how can we take advantage of them? And then what are they? So we'll first highlight a couple of general principles on what we need to do to respond to this. And then we can go into some more specifics. The first and obvious thing is to break the cynicism cap. Right now, so many people think, well, that's just the way it is, so there's nothing to do except get in the fight and hope that your side wins. And while utopian peace may be out of reach, I'm not a big believer in utopias, it's pretty undeniable that there are lots of things that could be done to make things better, and I think sharply reduce our risk of some kind of dystopian future. Now, in order to do this, we've got to, in the peace and conflict resolution communities and all of their affiliated fields, need to address the concerns of the skeptics. We're not talking about sort of the peacenik approach to society. The tie-dye peaceniks of my generation are in many, many ways naive. And we have to be honest about what the conflict and peace building fields know that really works and what they don't. And there are lots of skeptical ideas. Skeptics raise lots of important points that need to be addressed. So don't think this is a simple solution, and don't think that this is an endorsement of sort of the peace now comprehensive utopian vision of the world. It's a lot tougher than that. Still, we do need to build on what's been learned already. Too many people struggling with conflict problems spend way too much time reinventing the wheel, and they never really get to taking the next step. In this chart, it's a magnetic levitating super fast train. Which is certainly the step beyond the wheel. But we've got to somehow push people up the learning curve. Right now, people struggle their whole lives with conflict and they barely get to the point where they're starting to do better. We have to go beyond that. And what this suggests is that one part of the problem or one part of the solution is we have to raise civics and peace and conflict studies taken broadly and in the best sense of the word to um, equal, if not greater, prominence in educational curricula to science, technology, engineering, and math. Right now, we're devoting far too much attention to that, not enough attention to figuring out how to build a society in which we can live together. Um, so, again, going back to this, what are the steps that could be taken? And again, probably the first place to start is to start thinking about what are the insights that have come out of the conflict and peace building fields. And they've gotten over the years very good at handling table oriented, small, you get people together, sit around a table and talk things through. And they've been really very successful um, in dealing with an awful lot of very tough issues in a constructive way. It doesn't necessarily lead to agreement, but it leads to what we call constructive conflict. And one of the things that you try to do is you try to help people reframe the problem. And that's again something that the field knows how to do. And you want to get people to quit thinking about the situation as an us versus them kind of confrontation and reframe it in a way where both folks realize that they have a common enemy in the destructive conflict dynamics that are tearing them apart and making it impossible for either side to protect, much less advance its interests. So, this reframing to focus on conflict as the problem rather than each other as the problem is an important first step and something that we can then build on. Then another thing that the conflict field knows a lot about, and this has been a focus of their activities over the year, is how to limit and reverse the escalation spiral. And I've argued for my students for years that escalation is the most destructive force on the planet. It leads people to do unspeakable things, where provocation leads to counter provocation and an endless cycle. Well, we know a lot about how to reverse that, and what we need to do is to apply that knowledge. The other thing that we know a lot about that needs to be more widely applied is how to communicate accurately and get away from evil stereotypes that we have of one another. And an awful lot of the images that we have that become the driving force of our opposition to another group are just wrong. And so we know a lot about how to fix that. We also know a lot about how to obtain and effectively use real facts. I mean, we face some very difficult problems in a technical sense, and if we don't work them through them very carefully, what happens is that you wind up championing solutions that just flat won't work. So using facts, not just as a political weapon, but as a problem solving tool, is critical. And again, that's something we know a lot about how to do. We know a lot about how to work together collaboratively to take advantage of opportunities for mutual gain. Phrases like win-win and positive sum and zone of possible agreement have made it into the lexicon. Interest-based bargaining works. Other kinds of bargaining also work. We do know how to figure this stuff out. And if we build on these things, we also know ways to imagine together a positive future in which we'd all like to live. And once we have that, we can start to reconcile the wrongs of the past, which in many ways are unrightable. But the key is to work together to get a vision for the future that we'd all like for our children. The good news is that there are lots of organizations working to do this kind of work. The Bridge Alliance is kind of an umbrella of a bunch of these organizations, and it's not the only initiative out there. So that's one part of the solution. Um, And then the question worth asking, which I think is also important, are there other steps that could be taken by adjacent fields? These are fields that deal with conflict on a routine basis, but the conflict and peace building field at least thinks of them as a little bit separate. And just a couple of examples. There are an awful lot of really good ideas out there on how to reform democratic institutions in ways that remove a lot of the perverse incentives that are making it impossible for us to solve so many of our problems. There are also lots of good ideas out there, but not as many as we need for restructuring an economy where it becomes a positive sum win-win economy. Right now, it's way too much of a negative sum, or rather a zero sum economy, in which people figure that the way to get ahead is to take something from somebody else. We need an economy in which people figure that the way to get ahead is to work with somebody else to produce something more that you can both benefit from. And we need to figure out how to do this. And right now, the economy's not performing at that very well. And we need to understand how to prevent and reverse violence and war. We know a lot about peacemaking and peacekeeping and peace building. Um, and we need to get a handle on these emerging weapons, the possibility of another nuclear arms race, combined with the fact that we've let a lot of the arms control treaties that got us through the Cold War lapse. These are also areas in which there's lots of expertise that needs to be brought to bear on the problem. So, all of those things, that all sounds really good. Um, what are the limits on the implementation of these ideas that have to be overcome? And this is an area where we've been focusing in our Beyond Intractability project, which focuses, as I mentioned before, on society-wide conflicts that stubbornly resist resolution even when the best available technologies are used. And so there's a number of ideas here. I like to tell the story of the lost key syndrome. And this is a story of a guy who's walking across a parking lot one night and he sees somebody looking for under a street light for something. He says, "Hey, can I help? What'd you lose?" "Lost my keys." "Well, where'd you lose them?" "Oh, in that dark alley down there." "Well, why are you looking under the street light?" "Well, because the light's better here." And we tend to do that too much. That there are places to look for solutions to our conflict problems that are easy. So we concentrate our efforts there and we don't focus on the hard things. And that we need to do. Another way to think about this is we need to move beyond the preaching to the choir syndrome, where you bring together people from both sides of a conflict that tend to be inclined towards compromise anyway, and you work things through. Now, there's real value in doing that, but you've got to reach the people who don't want to come to some sort of a meeting. Right now, another way to think about this is market share. There are lots and lots, billions of conflict interactions in a society, and you could roughly divide those into constructive interactions, which tend to follow a lot of the principles that I was just talking about, and destructive interactions, which are the kinds of things that drive the escalation spiral, drive us apart, lead to violence, that sort of thing. And right now, the sad truth is that the preponderance of interactions, I think, are becoming increasingly constructive. So what we need to do is to slowly try to build market share. And as we do this, we need to recognize that there aren't win-win solutions for everything. There are conflict problems for which there is no zone of possible agreement that leaves both sides better off. And for that, we need to develop a system that wisely and equitably makes hard choices so that people look at it and say, "Well, that's not what I wanted, but I guess that's fair and it makes sense." And that will help us get through lots of other problems. But still, I think the biggest source of intractability at the moment is the sheer scale of modern society. I've shown this chart for a number of years to my students, and it was based on a panel I was on with a guy, a physicist. He was talking about how one of the privileges of being a physicist is to understand orders of magnitude. And he went on to explain how there was 4 orders of magnitude difference between the conventional blockbuster bombs of World War II and the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. And it's a huge difference. And that got me thinking, we tend to think in sort of table-oriented conflict resolution terms of maybe a mediation triad, 2 parties and a mediator, or maybe a big multi-party discussion that might have 30 people. But when you start thinking about even a medium-size conflict involving a medium size or even a small country, say Israel and Palestine roughly involves 30 million people. So that's on the order of 6 or 7 orders of magnitude bigger than the number of people who can fit around a table. And once you start thinking about quantitative differences on that scale, you need to start thinking qualitatively. And that's going to require pushing the envelope on what we know about conflict and peace building a great deal. That's why we see this as a decades long thing, the same way that the climate change movement has evolved. Another thing that drives all of this is the fact that there are multitudes of independent actors. And the illustration I use to explain this is a pool table. And the sort of image is you get everything all lined up to make the perfect pool shot. And that's what policy and strategy and planning is. And the idea is all the balls go in the pockets just the way that you want to. But the way very large scale societies work is it's kind of like a giant pool table with a gazillion balls and a zillion fellows, well, maybe not zillion, but millions of people trying to make the perfect shot at the same time on the same table. So you've got, in this sort of silly drawing, a lot of cues, and that's a very different kind of problem, and we need to come to grips with that. Now, one way to think about this is that at this large scale society level conflict, the unit isn't a table where people sit down face to face to talk to each other. It's the mass media environment. On the media bias chart, folks try to rank different media sources on a scale of political perspective and reliability, which I recommend. And the obvious suggestion is you try to focus on the top of the curve. But what this also does is illustrate how many different information sources are out there. And that doesn't even include the social media, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, all this sort of stuff. But that's the environment in which conflict is playing out. And we have to figure out how to scale up what we know how to do at the table level to this kind of environment. And that is going to be an enormous challenge. Though somewhat interestingly, Facebook has a program to train group moderators on how to deal with difficult issues. Another thing that we've got to be able to do, and this is also an obstacle, is to deal with the real complexity of human thought. People are not spreadsheets that do simple cost benefit calculations and do whatever the rational analysis says. There are a lot of cognitive biases that are non-rational, some of which are actually pretty good and pretty smart, but we need to build ways of dealing with conflict problems that recognize the way people really think. And that's also going to be a big but not impossible challenge. Now, still, another huge part of why we're in such trouble, though, is not that we are and people are acting in good faith and trying to work it out and just can't because the problems are difficult. It's that there are folks out there, I call them divide and conquer politicians, that have figured out that their key to political power is to drive us apart. And I've already talked about mobilize the base politics. And that's the sort of thing that both sides do. And it's even arguably good politics, but it raises obviously some pretty tough issues. But they're also tyrant wannabes that are playing this game. And this goes all the way back to Philip of Macedonia. And they try to act as puppeteers and they get people fighting one another. Now, just a window into this, and there are a bunch of citations on the website, is information about the great Russian disinformation campaign and the election and all of that. And if you look at it, and step away from the partisan aspects of this. I'm not sure how much of an effect it had on the last election, but it's pretty clear that the techniques that were laid out here were part of a deliberate effort to drive a society apart. And it was a hostile act, and we've got to find some way to defend ourselves against that. But this includes, a compilation of all the ads the Russians posted on Facebook and a description of their propaganda model and their hybrid warfare tactic. And here are a few more citations that go into the Cambridge Analytica and how they were basically manufacturing fake trusted friends to give people political advice. But keep in mind that this isn't just about the Russians. We're doing a lot of these things to ourselves. And if we're going to defend democracy and make it work, we've got to defend it from folks who are willing to spend a lot of money on a concerted attack against it. And that's again another set of challenges, which is why we think that the conflict problem requires an effort of the scope of the climate change problem, which basically involves lots of money, lots of people working in pretty much every part of the world to try to push back against this stuff. So, how can we build a movement capable of addressing such a daunting array of problems? And here are a couple principles that I think are pretty clear. One is that we need a specialization-based. We call it a massively parallel strategy. The way modern computing is able to do these astonishing things that it does is not by having one super duper ultra smart processor that does everything, but what it has is a staggering number of um, small computers. They're basically processors out of cell phones because they use less power that are arranged and they work on different aspects of the problem in parallel on a truly massive level. This is what the big idea behind the division of labor specialization that Emil Durkheim, this is how modern society works, is we have to specialize. And we have to specialize on different aspects of the conflict problem as well. We've put together this list, which is just a preliminary list of all of the things that need to be done in order to address the conflict problem. And ultimately, what we need are substantial numbers of people in pretty much all area or all geographic locations working on each of these things. Again, that's why it's a daunting problem. And what the initiative is trying to do is to get people to start thinking about how to do this. Another key, I think, is to think long term, not just short term. I tell the story that compares the fight against polio with the war on cancer. And when I was a child, everybody was terrified about polio. And then one bright day, they invented the vaccine. And I still vividly remember getting the sugar cube that was the end of polio. And it's tempting to look for some sort of quick solution to our conflict problem like that. And some people think it's just winning the next election, but it isn't. What we need to do is to, well, the comparison is the war on cancer. In 1970, Richard Nixon started the war on cancer. We are now 5 decades into the war on cancer. We've made progress in basic research, applied research, treatments are getting better, but cancer is still a terrible disease that we are a long way from fighting. It's going to be the case with conflict. It's going to take us decades. We will slowly get better, but it will continue to be a terrible threat. And sometimes we're going to have to suffer the consequences of not being able to deal with this. But we've got to persist, and we've got to think of it in this big, long-term struggle terms. The other thing is, and this I think is a source of optimism, is we've got to harness a make a difference drive. And when I talk to my students, the big thing people want to do with their lives is to make a difference somehow. And this is a way to do it. And I'm including this poster from World War II, which was the last big time that our society got together in a massively parallel effort. And the phrase that my mom always liked to quote from the war was, "The difficult we do right away, the impossible takes a little longer." So what we need to do is to get a sense that we can do it and start working. We need to publicize practical things that everybody can do. My favorite bumper sticker is to think globally in terms of this big problem I've laid out, but act locally. Work on part of the problem in one of these specialized areas in your neighborhood. And don't be a free rider and let other people take care of it. Everybody's got to be part of the solution or they're part of the problem. We need to recognize that there's real urgency to the situation, that things are spinning out of control fast. And just like climate change, the worse it gets, the harder it's going to be to fix. So the faster we can work on this, the better off we're going to be. This takes us back to the Constructive Conflict Initiative. What we're trying to do simply is make a lot more people aware of the seriousness of the threat posed by intractable conflict, and to convene a discussion of how we might be able to all work together over the short and the long term to start addressing some of these problems. At the moment, we're trying to do this on a very limited budget, and we could really use some additional support. So if you can see your way clear to make a donation, we'd really appreciate it. Finally, I'll leave you on an optimistic note. We're really encouraged by the large numbers of people who are becoming active in efforts to demand an effective response to the climate change problem. We'd like to suggest that some of those efforts also go into addressing the conflict problem. As Uncle Sam said in World War II, we want you. And this time, at least we can take some comfort in the fact that we're not being asked to volunteer for a war. All we're asked to do is to figure out how we can live together.